This might be for life. Yeah. This might be for life. Stand up when the chief is here. Hands up. Yeah, the chief is here. Stand up when the chief is here. Hands up. Yeah, the chief is here. Yeah, this might be for life.
Good morning, everybody. We've got a bit of an early start here, so I'm sure a lot of you will be watching this on the recording. But I really want to welcome David Seymour all the way from New Zealand. It's evening time in New Zealand, morning time in Cape Town. We can see a guitar in the background, David. Is that, do you play it?
Not very well.
Not very well. Okay. And David is the politician in New Zealand that I would vote for. Every time and as you all know, my wife is a Kiwi, Kate the Kiwi, Dr. Kate the Kiwi. So I love the country. I love New Zealand, great admirer of the country, and captured her, brought her to South Africa. And we travel to New Zealand sort of once every 2 years to see the family. And one little thing is that one of my brothers-in-law is the co-head of the Green Party in New Zealand. And when I wrote to David saying I'd love to chat to you, I said, I think I might be the only member of the family that wouldn't vote for my brother-in-law. I'd be voting for David. So David, welcome. Tell us a little bit about who you are. Give us the little background, if you will.
Oh, well, look, first of all, thank you for taking an interest in our politics and our party. So my name's David Seymour. I'm the Member of Parliament for the Epsom electorate, which is in central Auckland. I also lead the ACT Party. ACT is a classical liberal party. Our constitution says that we are here to stand up for the rights and freedoms of people in New Zealand. And we're also here to promote limited government. So we don't think the government should take the responsibilities that people are able to take for themselves. Whereas a lot of our opponents start from the basis that everything is collectivized, and maybe they'll let you decide what sort of individual freedoms you might be allowed to have after that. So that's our basic philosophy, and that comes out in a lot of ways. The End of Life Choice Act legalized assisted dying, or some people call it euthanasia in New Zealand. And we think that's really important, that people should be able to choose freely under the law, so long as they're not harming others. And of course, so long as there's sufficient protections, they won't be harmed. I think the legislation achieves that. We've also been responsible for charter schools. We've spent a lot of time defending free speech. We think that, the problem with the kinds of hate speech laws and restrictions people like to put in place is that oftentimes, it sounds like a good idea, but it's very difficult to restrain the censor once you give somebody the power to silence speech just because it's politically unpopular. So those are some of the issues that we promote. And of course, we're also very much in favour on the economic side of free markets. We believe that a system of private property rights, low and flat taxes, and a regulatory regime that's designed only to deal with real market failures, not regulations designed to impose one group of people's preferences on another, are very important, because otherwise you can spend a lot of your life complying with regulation and less time actually doing things to provide for yourself and your family and communities. So that's in a nutshell who we are. We currently hold 10 out of 120 seats in New Zealand's parliament, and I think that would make us one of the more successful classical liberal parties that is economically conservative and socially liberal in the world.
Do you know, that depresses me a little bit, because everything you've said I agree with. This is an echo chamber. We may disagree on rugby, but that'll be a friendly disagreement. But I agree with everything you've said. I believe in limited government. I really believe in the libertarian agenda, the classical libertarian agenda. And to have 10 out of 100 plus seats, is very good, especially if you look at relative to other countries in the world. But isn't it sad that worldwide, our philosophy isn't deeper ingrained? Do you think that's the education system's to blame? The fact that the lefties have captured the education agenda over the last couple of decades and don't teach Adam Smith and, all our classical libertarian
Well, look,
philosophy?
I have a bit more optimism. I think that, fundamentally our view of the world is winning. If you look at the rights and freedoms that most individuals enjoy around the world, it's rapidly expanding. I mean, you look at the rights of women over the last 100 years, dramatically expanded to the point where, at least in most Western democracies, we have legal equality. For most of human history, we haven't had legal equality between men and women. Huge progress being made in developing countries on that as well. You look at people's sexuality, increasingly in the Western world, you have marriage equality. If you look at the rights of people to freely go about their business without violence, by and large, that's improving. And free trade has meant that billions of people have come out of poverty in the last 30 years. The period that we've had more free markets, more free trade in the world has been an incredible period for alleviating poverty globally. So, you have to say that by and large, we are winning, but we're winning because fundamentally a free society unleashes people's creativity and it works better. Freedom works better than state control. However, you're right that in politics, it is very hard to sell because most people go into elections with two basic tools for winning votes. One is to find a group of people that have money or assets and say, vote for me, I will take off them and give to you. And that's quite a powerful way to get votes. And it tends to lead to the size and scope of state spending in democracies expanding over time, because it's always easier to get votes by giving, basically a right to take other people's money than it is to take it away. Secondly, people tend to go into politics and promise to make laws and regulations that will impose your values on someone else. In ACT, we don't use those tools. We have this wonderful counterintuitive mission to win political power, but we don't want to use it to take other people's money or force excessive regulation on them. That's obviously more difficult as a road to tread, and I think that's why it's more difficult for classical liberal parties to win power in elections. But we know that fundamentally in the long term, it will deliver better outcomes for people if we have greater personal freedom. So, that's our starting point. I'm not as pessimistic as some people, but I do acknowledge the challenge, and I think it's a wonderful challenge. That's why I do it. To win political power and use it to advance freedom is a worthwhile thing to do.
And ACT and National are potentially allies, aren't they, in New Zealand?
Well, we are, but I think there's probably two differences between us and the National Party. One is that the National Party is often a morally conservative party. So if you look at the End of Life Choice Act that I mentioned earlier, the majority of National MPs voted against it. I think the second issue is there's a difference between being a party of reform and a party of the status quo. So, for instance, you mentioned before we started the flag. John Key, who was Prime Minister for 8 years, a National Party leader, said that his greatest regret was failing to change the New Zealand flag. Well, ACT has generally had a more expansive agenda when it comes to trying to create a freer society and better policy for all New Zealanders. So I guess we are more liberal on the social side and more ambitious in terms of economic reform.
I mean, I love the new designs for the flag that were put up. And I must say, I do credit New Zealand with putting the right things to a referendum. So you had a referendum on the flag, and in my view, sadly, there was a great one that wasn't chosen, a very cool new identity flag, be that as it may. And then you had two referendums recently, which I'd love you to tell people about. One was the legalization of cannabis, which failed. The other was the right to the end of life. And you really were very important in both of those, and the right to life went through. So do you want to just put those two up, tell everyone what happened?
Yeah, sure. So the election that New Zealand held on, I think it was the 16th or 17th of October, it seems like a long time ago now, this year, was a general election to elect a parliament, but also had two referenda attached to it. One of them concerned the legalisation of the growth and supply of cannabis, and the other was to ratify the End of Life Choice Act. So taking the cannabis one first, there was a provisional piece of legislation that had been drafted but not introduced to Parliament, and the referendum was really, in effect, an indicative vote on whether Parliament should subsequently introduce and pass that legislation. It failed for quite a number of reasons. I think the fact that the legislation was a bit uncertain was part of the problem. But I also think there was a difficulty stemming from the fact that when you try to make reform, you have to show people that there's a clear problem to be solved. So if you look at cannabis in New Zealand, we don't have mass incarceration of people for cannabis crimes. We do have, like the United States, I think a little bit of discrimination around policing that is ethnically biased, but nothing like what they experience in America, and certainly not when it comes to drug crimes. So, that big problem that might motivate you to vote for legalization in the US, for example, doesn't really exist here. There was a debate in the 2017 election where it emerged that the number of people in prison for cannabis possession in New Zealand was 7 people. So who knows? Those people could have got out by now. So that big problem didn't exist. The second reason that a lot of people might support cannabis legalization is for people who are suffering in some way and feel that cannabis would be a good form of medication for them. There's a lot of sympathy for that view. But the government has legalised medicinal cannabis, so that wasn't really on the agenda. And then you sort of say, well, what's left? Well, really, it was a vote for convenience. Should you be able to vote to have cannabis at your local store of some description? And I don't think that people were especially animated by that. I mean, it didn't lose by very much. It only lost by a couple of percentage points. But the failure to define a well understood and widely appreciated problem was always the difficulty. I personally, when asked, I think you said I played an important role in this. I don't think that's quite true. I certainly, when asked, said that the major reason that you might support cannabis law reform in New Zealand is to prevent people going into the black market to access cannabis and then being upsold onto harder, more dangerous drugs. So we have a drug called P, it stands for pure methamphetamine. I'm sure that it exists in South Africa. I don't know what it's called there.
I think it's called TIC.
TIC, okay.
TIK,
well, yeah, so it's basically methamphetamine, and it's very dangerous stuff. It makes people commit violent crimes, or at least it doesn't make them, but it's certainly they're more likely to commit those crimes if they take it. And that, I think, was the stronger argument. But it wasn't an argument that was made widely by the proponents. So look, the failure to define a problem, the ambiguity about what the legislation might look like if there was a yes vote and Parliament was to set about legislating, meant that it didn't get over the line. But, the flip side of all that is that while, as a classical liberal, I don't really think prohibition's been a successful policy. Most people, should they want to, can usually get access to cannabis and face almost no possibility of being punished for doing it. The New Zealand police will not arrest you for smoking a joint. They just can't be bothered doing it. They don't think it's worthwhile. And I suspect now that almost 50% of people have voted in favour of legalisation, it's going to be very difficult to find a jury that will convict a person for it.
You've actually put this argument extremely well. I hadn't thought it through from A to Z in that way. So well done. But you were pretty important in the right to die. I had a role in the End of Life Choice Act in the sense that I was the member who had my name on the bill. So
It was a private member's bill. I was asked to be. I looked at this issue. We had a woman named Lucretia Seals, who was a lawyer with a very rare and painful form of brain cancer, who spent her dying days petitioning the courts to have a declaration that she could ask her doctor to help end her life. She became quite a hero and a martyr for that, and that certainly attracted a lot of interest. I decided that, given I had the incredible parliamentary privilege of being able to actually put a piece of legislation into a random ballot that might be selected and actually debated, because only 90 people at any given time can do that, and I'll tell you why it's 90 in a second. I decided I should do it. I decided that we pride ourselves in New Zealand, whether it's true or not, half the time, as being a progressive, liberal, humanistic country that cares about people's well-being and doesn't want them to suffer unduly. And I felt that it was a cause that brought together compassion and also freedom under the law. So I put this bill in the ballot in June 2015. It was drawn from the ballot almost 2 years later, I think in about July 2017. We then had an election in September 2017. In December, it was debated for the first time. It passed by 76 to 44. It then went through a very protracted select committee process. There were over 40,000 submissions. You've got to remember our population in New Zealand's only 5 million, so I think about 12 times smaller than yours. So that's like getting 500,000 submissions in South African terms. And that period was probably the longest select committee process that any legislation in recent memory, at least, and probably living memory, has had in New Zealand. But eventually it passed its second reading by 70 to 50, and finally its third reading by 69 to 51, with another long stage that went on for about 3 or 4 months of debates by committee, in which all MPs participated between the second and third reading. So as of November 2019, it had been passed into legislation, and that legislation had a very important condition. In order to get the 69 votes, we made a deal with a party called New Zealand First, subsequently gone out of Parliament. But that party,
Peters.
That's right. He was the leader of the party, and he insisted they would only vote for the legislation if we added a referendum. So one of the things that happened between the second and third reading is that we added this referendum clause, which said this law has been passed, but it will only come into force if a majority of New Zealanders vote for it to be so at a referendum. So there were two big differences from the cannabis law. One was that people knew exactly what they were voting for. Parliament had voted for this legislation, put it into law. It had been signed by the Governor-General on behalf of the Queen in the longest, most arduous lawmaking process that has been seen in New Zealand for a very long time, if not forever. Second of all, and more importantly, in contrast to the cannabis issue, it was addressing a very real problem that New Zealanders have seen bad death. Almost everybody knows somebody. It's a small minority of people that die really badly because, palliative care is good and we do respect it. We don't see it as the enemy here, although regrettably a lot of people in the palliative care space saw our legislation as an enemy. Now, what this meant is that we were able to say to people, look, this is a very clear solution to a very clear problem. And in the event, New Zealanders, by almost a margin of 2 to 1, I think we got about 65-point-something% in favour, almost by a margin of 2 to 1, New Zealanders voted that the law should come into force. So that was very gratifying. But my role in it was that I had my name on the bill. I was the member I used that privilege I had as a parliamentarian to sponsor it. But it was an effort by a big team, people from civil society. Lucretia Seals, who I mentioned, her lawyers helped a lot. People from different political parties formed a cross-party working group. So I was really just the front man for it.
But well done. Congratulations. And you should take credit for it. So certainly from me and our audience. David, I wanted to ask you about the gun control issue. I'm a believer in the Second Amendment And I particularly believe in the following sentence that, the Second Amendment allows the protection of the individual against the tyranny of the state, the right to bear arms to protect the individual against the tyranny of the state. I fundamentally believe that. And in South Africa, a very violent country, it is very difficult to get a gun license. When I came back here, I've always had shotguns and rifles in Europe and things like that for hunting. But I came back and I said to Katie, I'm going to get a handgun. I just want to be able to defend myself. And she was really anti that for about 2 years. And I said, I'm sorry, my department is defense in the family, and I'm going ahead. And it took me, 6, 7, 8 months I knew how to handle one, but to actually get that gun license. And in South Africa, we're licensed per gun, which doesn't make any sense. You should be actually licensed per individual and then have whatever guns you have. It's very hard to get a gun license here. And the one thing, if the ANC are listening to this, if you want to get rid of me, take away my gun license, because that's the one thing that I really do believe in. Now, I think you were the only person who resisted or at least put up your hand when the new gun control laws came in after that terrible shooting in Christchurch in the mosque. Tell us the nuances of that, because I'm sure it's not as simple as freedom of speech.
So first of all, I think it's probably a different debate in New Zealand than what it is in South Africa or the United States. New Zealanders have a very high ownership of firearms, a very high rate of ownership. But it's never really been a political thing. It might be for a few, but by and large, our firearm ownership rate reflects the fact that New Zealand is basically, outside of a few cities, a very rural, very agricultural place. It's a very big country. It doesn't look like a big country on the map, because New Zealand on the map is next to Australia and the Pacific Ocean, two of the biggest features on the planet. But if you superimpose New Zealand on top of Europe or the eastern seaboard of the United States, you see how big it is. Very spread out, very rural. Lots of people love to go out and hunt and do pest control and manage their farms and have a lot of firearms as a result. And there's a lot of people who recreationally like to target shoot and pistol shoot and so on, and good on them. So it's probably not the kind of charged political issue that it is in the States or perhaps South Africa. However, it is true that the ACT Party has always stood for the rule of law, for due process, and for people's rights as people. And the way that the government went about its response to the terrorist attacks in Christchurch is that they did no analysis, no problem definition.
They rushed it through, didn't they?
Yeah, in 9 days they passed the law that basically banned centerfire semi-automatic rifles. And of course that meant, and then they had to run a buyback, which was an enormous failure. It's estimated only a quarter of the firearms banned were actually handed in. The rest appear to have disappeared. So, it was a bad process, it was a bad outcome, and it was premature. Now, as it happens, just last week, a Royal Commission of Inquiry, a very high-powered 800-page report into what actually happened, came out. And what happened is that the police gave a firearm license to a terrorist. They were supposed to interview people that knew the person. They interviewed people who he knew primarily through online gaming forums. This was a guy who was not a New Zealander. He was from Australia. He got off the plane. He was a single male living alone. He'd traveled to all sorts of quite unusual places, North Korea, Pakistan, the Balkans, Turkey. Nothing wrong with any of these places, but it's an odd pattern. And well, maybe North Korea.
Yeah, maybe North Korea.
Yeah. He'd actually visited a whole lot of sites where historically Christians and Muslims had fought. So this guy, has this profile straight off the plane, single guy living alone, weird travel history, saying all sorts of crazy things on the internet. And the police gave him a license improperly and then signed off a mail order form for him to buy 3,000 rounds of ammo. No one in our system was saying, now the police, who should be culpable for all this, instead of saying, geez, we got to improve our systems, which would have been the right thing to do, advised the government to ban a whole lot of law-abiding people from having firearms, and then proceeded to basically collect the firearms from all the most law-abiding people. So,
Right.
in terms of making policy to achieve an objective and achieving and protecting people's rights and treating every person with human dignity, it was just an enormous failure, and I could not go along with it.
And you were right, by the way. I took a hell of a beating because I was in New Zealand at the time. I took a hell of a beating from my in-laws, 3 of whom was James's one, but the other 2 are lawyers, New Zealand lawyers. So it's one South African capitalist versus 3 regulators and lawyers, and I got beaten up on that one. But I think you're absolutely right. It was just rushed through. Very quickly on the hate speech laws, and this is something that really troubles me. When you look at Canada, and I'm no fan of Trudeau at all. I think he's a woke liberal. Anyway, we won't go down that line. I don't like him. They've implemented laws on gender pronouns and hate speech that I think are detrimental to freedom of speech and detrimental to liberties. Where did New Zealand end up on the hate speech laws? Where is it in process? Can it be?
Well, there's been some developments. In fact, as we speak, I've just received a letter from a government minister who is proposing to change these laws, and I intend to respond to that. Look, I mean, the government has taken the view that because a terrorist who is a foreigner who brought his ideas from largely outside New Zealand came here, we need to flagellate ourselves, take a good hard look at ourselves, and have better attitudes. In reality, the attitudes that New Zealanders as a whole showed in the wake of our nation's tragedy was extraordinary. I mean, it was the best day for florists, or the best week for florists probably in the history of flowers. People were putting flowers outside mosques all over the country. There were, walls of flowers that stretched for hundreds of meters in some places, particularly in Christchurch. That was, it really brought out the best in New Zealand. Now we're saying that we have to all make rules and correct ourselves because we're all bad people. It makes no sense. But of course, I'm sure it'll be, familiar to you that the real problem with a hate speech law is that there's no objective defence against that law. It's purely a matter of opinion whether you...
And how long is a piece of string? How long is a piece of string?
Well, and the people in charge of prosecuting it tend to be people who are highly politicised. So I think the proposal is the Human Rights Commission should somehow be involved. Well, the Human Rights Commission, has a disability rights commissioner who ran a political campaign against the End of Life Choice Act for several years, the basic premise of which was that disabled people are a bit feeble, and if we offer more choices, they might make the wrong ones. It's so offensive. And these are the kinds of people who will be deciding whether or not what you've said is offensive or not. And there's no defence. I mean, you don't know if you've committed hate speech until the verdict is delivered. Whereas, you look at something like burglary, there's a series of defences. Did you enter the property? Did you commit a crime while you're there? Did you have the legal right to enter the property? These are tests that you can bring to your aid if you're charged. So it's something that has to be defeated. And free speech matters, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that, to be human is to have your own thoughts. I don't think if you have all those beautiful animals over there in South Africa, I think lions and elephants are majestic, but I don't imagine they have a lot going on in terms of original thought that's unique to that particular animal.
Elephant, a little bit.
Elephant, yeah, okay. Elephants are pretty cool, but to be human is to think your thoughts. I think it's human to be able to share them. But second of all, if we wish to make social progress, I mean, one of the greatest New Zealanders, in my view, was Kate Shepherd, who was the campaigner for women's votes. And Kate Shepherd was a tremendous orator. Her views were not necessarily popular. She might have been a target for censors. Well, we're not going to make progress like that if we have a pall of conformity over what you're allowed to say.
David, the audience don't know this, but I win tons of bets on this particular issue. But I always say to people, which country was the first country to give women the vote and in which year? And people go, Sweden, Switzerland. By the way, Switzerland was 1970.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Sweden, Switzerland, they go all these lots of European countries. It's with New Zealand.
Well, New Zealand was the first country where women took the right to vote, and good on them.
130 years ago. Is that right?
127 years ago. It was 1893 on September 19th.
There we go. Wow. Okay. Well done. So New Zealand was number one. A quick, we have to wrap up quite soon, and I know you've got lots to do, and I'm very grateful for this conversation. But I always joke with my wife. I go, remember Lord of the Rings? I say, take New Zealand and South Africa. New Zealand are the hobbits. You live on an island with no enemy, no countries, contiguous countries other than Australia, which is kind of a province of America, really. I mean, they all wish they were Americans, I think. So New Zealand has no neighbors, has no real pollution. I mean, I know you can say the cows produce methane and methane destroys the atmosphere, but you don't have manufacturing pollution like the Chinese do. You did your amazing treaty 200 or so years ago with the Maoris, and I know you've got some Maori ancestry through your mum. And I always joke at her, I say sort of New Zealand's not a real country because it has no racism, no manufacturing problems, no pollution, no threats, no military, nothing. It's not a real country. It's the hobbits. Whereas South Africa, we've got just about every problem known to man and invented. We're right on the edge of Mordor. We're a real country dealing with real issues. But I do that just as a joke. I mean, I'm very grateful actually that New Zealand can debate these issues in a sensible way and come up with sensible solutions, sensible bills, referendi to resolve them, because the world needs to be looking at what New Zealand does. New Zealand's a very balanced, intelligent country. And I know my in-laws are going to beat me up for saying it, but I'm sort of very proud to have, to be part New Zealander. So it's quite interesting. I follow quite closely and what you're up to. But also internationally, you'll see that a lot of these issues, when they bring in a top judge to deal with an international issue, in many cases, it's a New Zealander. You have a great, great global influence. So very proud to have you, New Zealanders. Keep on ticking. And David, how do we get you to run the country? New Zealand, that is, not South Africa.
Well, I got no intention of running the country. Maybe one day we'll run the New Zealand government, which is one of many institutions in our pluralistic society, and an institution that's far too large in its size and scope, in my view. But look, I mean, I'm just lucky to be able to go out there and articulate a view that a free society that treats every person with greater dignity is a better society and one we should look to live in, even though often it goes against our most basic instincts to follow the tribe, follow the leader, and so on. And as long as I can keep doing that and people keep voting for me and supporting me to do it, then I think that's a really, really great thing that I'm grateful to be able to do.
And finally, and I can tell your phone's buzzing off the hook because you've got other things to do. I said I wouldn't mention rugby, but it's just ingrained. South Africa, New Zealand is the great the battle of the giants. Yeah. Which South African rugby player impresses you the most, and which one irritates you the most? So to me, it's Tana Umaga. I love Tana Umaga. He would have made my international team. And most irritating was Richie McCaw because he was so good. We keep saying Richie was a cheat, which he drove us nuts because he was so damn good.
I remember a guy called Chester Williams in the 95 World Cup, and I thought he was really impressive. And it was such an important time for South Africa. To see Nelson Mandela come out in that Springbok jersey.
Francois Pienaar,
Yeah, and Francois Pienaar as well. That was very cool. Look, I mean, you'd probably be a bit disappointed, but I wouldn't let a Springbok irritate me. It mostly just run over or around them.
Good answer, David. Listen, fantastic speaking to you. You're very welcome to come and visit South Africa at some point.
Yeah, one day I'd love to.
Great to have you over here, and tell us what you think. We've got all the problems in the world to solve. Maybe you can help us with a few of them.
Yeah,
but keep on going.
Yeah, I know you guys face some challenges over there, I just wish you all the best in working through them.
David, looking to great successes for you, and thank you very much. All the best.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.